On April 29, 2018, a fisherman noticed something strange floating near the shoreline of the Cove River in Sydney, Australia. Concerned by what he saw, he immediately contacted the authorities. When emergency responders arrived on the scene, they made a tragic discovery that would spark a heartbreaking criminal investigation. Initially, the authorities had no idea who she was. Soon, they linked the unidentified woman to a missing person. Later that same day, Cecilia's family was contacted by police and asked to assist in identifying. Sadly, their worst fears were confirmed. It was indeed Cecilia. Cecilia Bruna Haddad came into the world during the warm and colorful autumn of 1979 in the dynamic city of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. From an early age, Cecilia demonstrated exceptional intelligence, maturity, and an unwavering determination that set her apart from her peers. After completing her secondary education with top marks, Cecilia was accepted into the prestigious Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, one of Brazil's most respected and competitive private institutions. She chose to study business and economics, fields that matched her analytical mind and strong organizational skills. Upon graduating with distinction, Cecilia immediately began applying for jobs at major companies. It wasn't long before she was invited to interview at one of the country's leading mining firms, an industry known for its complexity and high standards. The interview process was rigorous, but Cecilia's impressive credentials and confident demeanor left a strong impression. She was offered a position almost immediately, marking the beginning of what would become a rapidly ascending career. Within just a year of joining the company, Cecilia had already climbed the corporate ladder. Her superiors recognized her strategic thinking, professionalism, and ability to handle pressure with grace. At the age of 27, with a bright future ahead of her, she made a bold decision that would change the trajectory of her life. She accepted an offer to work overseas in Australia. The opportunity promised professional growth, financial independence, and new experiences. Although the decision meant leaving behind her family, friends, and familiar surroundings, Cecilia welcomed the challenge with open arms. Relocating to Australia was no small feat. It involved adjusting to a different culture, building new relationships, and learning to navigate a professional landscape that was both exciting and unfamiliar. Cecilia accepted a managerial role at one of the largest mining companies in the country. She not only thrived in her new role, but also built a wide network of professional contacts. By 2016, having spent nearly a decade advancing her career in Australia, Cecilia took another ambitious step. She founded her own consulting company, an entrepreneurial venture designed to provide mentorship and guidance to those looking to start or expand their businesses. Her firm specialized in helping newcomers, particularly immigrants, navigate the complex Australian market. Her initiative quickly gained traction, and her reputation as a knowledgeable and empathetic advisor continued to grow. During this time, Cecilia also prioritized her family. She made it a personal mission to help her younger brother and sister join her in Australia. With her support, they were able to secure employment and begin building their own lives abroad. Professionally, Cecilia was flourishing. She had earned a second degree, expanded her network, and frequently traveled for business and leisure. Her social media reflected a life filled with accomplishments and memorable moments. However, her personal life remained more complicated. Despite her many achievements, romantic stability eluded her. Nonetheless, she remained hopeful and continued to believe that a meaningful and lasting relationship was still within reach. In the mid-2000s, during her early years in Sydney, Cecilia entered into a romantic relationship with a co-worker. Their bond quickly deepened, and in time, they decided to marry. For a while, things seemed promising. However, the marriage lasted less than 3 years. Though their relationship ended, it did so amicably. The pair parted ways without bitterness or legal disputes, choosing instead to maintain a cordial and respectful friendship. In 2016, shortly after her divorce, and as her consulting business was gaining momentum, Cecilia decided to return to Brazil for a brief visit. Her return was marked by joy and celebration. Those close to her were delighted to see how much she had achieved. On the third day of her stay, something unexpected happened. Cecilia ran into Mario, a former boyfriend she hadn't seen in nearly a decade. Their breakup years earlier had been amicable, but their lives had taken very different paths. While Cecilia had built a successful life abroad, Mario had remained in Brazil, facing various financial and personal setbacks. The encounter stirred up a mix of emotions. In the days that followed, the two rekindled their friendship, reminiscing about old times and visiting familiar places from their past. The connection between them seemed to reignite naturally. After returning to Australia, Cecilia and Mario continued to communicate daily through messages, calls, and video chats. The emotional bond deepened quickly. Within a month, Cecilia had arranged for Mario to come to Sydney, believing that their reunion was a second chance at happiness. Upon his arrival, Mario moved into Cecilia's spacious apartment, located in an upscale part of the city. At first, things seemed hopeful. Cecilia provided for him financially, helping him adjust to his new life. She went so far as to use her business network to help him find a well-paying job. Ever supportive, she encouraged his career development and took great pride in watching him begin to find his footing in a new country. However, as time passed, the relationship began to shift. Mario, once grateful and cooperative, started expressing dissatisfaction with his job and developed an interest in Cecilia's business. He increasingly wanted to be involved in her work, despite lacking the necessary experience. Tensions began to rise as he questioned her decisions and asked for a share in the company. Their arguments became more frequent and emotionally taxing. Cecilia, always diplomatic, tried her best to de-escalate the situation, but the pressure continued to mount. Mario began exhibiting controlling behavior, such as taking her phone without asking and accessing her work laptop. He started to isolate her from close friends and coworkers, making it difficult for her to maintain a healthy support system. Despite her efforts to maintain peace, Cecilia found herself emotionally exhausted. She had invested so much in helping Mario, yet the relationship no longer brought her happiness or stability. After nearly a year of trying to salvage the partnership, she came to a difficult but necessary decision. She sat down with Mario for a calm and honest conversation, explaining that she could no longer continue the relationship under the current circumstances. This final conversation proved to be a turning point, though not in the way anyone had hoped. When Cecilia calmly told Mario that their relationship was over and that she no longer wished to have any contact with him, his reaction was intense and deeply unsettling. Rather than accepting her decision with maturity or respect, Mario erupted in a storm of emotions. The news of their separation wasn't just painful for him, it shattered a fantasy he had refused to let go of. This was the last straw in a long series of emotional highs and lows between them. Cecilia, having reached her emotional limit, asked him to leave her home immediately. It was not a dramatic moment filled with raised voices or emotional pleas, just a firm and resolute decision from a woman determined to take back control of her life. At first, Mario appeared shaken. He tried to plead with her, repeatedly sending heartfelt messages full of apologies, declarations of love, and promises to change. But Cecilia stood her ground. She had come to understand, after many months of emotional distress, that words were no longer enough. Realizing that the situation wasn't going to unfold the way he had hoped, Mario shifted his approach. His once romantic messages gradually turned into manipulative ones, messages laced with guilt, subtle pressure, and eventually, overt threats. Soon after, his behavior escalated from verbal intimidation to something far more troubling: persistent stalking. Cecilia began to notice his presence in places he had no reason to be, outside her office, near her apartment, and even at locations she visited only occasionally. The situation came to a head one night in January 2018. It was late, and Cecilia had just returned home from a long day of work when she heard a knock at the door. To her shock, it was Mario. She hesitated, initially refusing to open the door, but he continued knocking insistently. His voice, though low, carried a tone that made her uneasy. Eventually, without her consent, he forced his way inside. His actions were erratic and frightening. Inside the apartment, the situation grew even more alarming. An argument quickly escalated, and Mario's behavior became unpredictable. Despite being physically smaller and emotionally drained, Cecilia's instincts kicked in. She managed to escape his immediate reach and locked herself in another room, using whatever she could to barricade the door. From behind the door, she begged him to calm down, to think rationally, to leave and never come back. It was only when she threatened to involve law enforcement that he finally relented and left the apartment. In the aftermath, Cecilia was shaken. But despite the severity of the incident, she chose not to report it to the authorities. Perhaps she hoped that it had been a one-time outburst. Perhaps she feared the consequences of escalating the situation further. Or maybe, on some level, she still believed that Mario could find peace and move on. Instead of pressing charges, she decided it was safer to leave her apartment temporarily. For a while, she lived with her sister Carol, and later stayed with her longtime friend Rita. Both women were alarmed by what Cecilia told them. They encouraged her, pleaded with her even, to go to the police and file a formal report. But Cecilia, despite her inner turmoil, continued to hold back. She expressed concern about the consequences for Mario and the stigma that might follow. In her mind, she was protecting him as much as she was trying to protect herself. After about a month of living away, Cecilia returned to her apartment in early April 2018. Though she had tried to reclaim some sense of normalcy, what she discovered upon returning unsettled her all over again. Small signs indicated that Mario had been in the apartment during her absence. The most disturbing realization came when she discovered that Mario still had a spare key. Neighbors later confirmed Cecilia's suspicions. Several residents had seen Mario loitering around the building, sometimes even standing near her apartment floor. When neighbors gently urged Cecilia to notify the authorities, she declined once again, insisting that she could manage things on her own. She believed, or perhaps hoped, that he would eventually tire and move on. For the next 2 weeks, Cecilia lived in a heightened state of anxiety. She avoided turning on lights at night, kept her movements quiet, and tried to appear as though she wasn't home. On the rare occasions she left the apartment, she did so cautiously, watching carefully for any sign of Mario. If she sensed even the slightest risk, she would stay with her sister or a friend instead. The psychological stress was overwhelming. Cecilia, once a confident and assertive woman, now lived in fear of the person she had once trusted most. Then, just as suddenly as things had spiraled, they seemed to settle. On April 25, 2018, Mario called Cecilia. His tone was calm, almost unusually so. He told her he had thought everything over and had come to terms with their separation. He apologized sincerely and said he understood that they needed to move on. He then mentioned that he had purchased a ticket to fly back to Rio de Janeiro and would be leaving early in the morning on April 28th. Before ending the call, he asked to see her one final time. He said he wanted a proper goodbye, one that would give both of them closure. Cecilia was hesitant but eventually agreed, on the condition that the meeting take place at the airport. She immediately called her sister Carol to relay the details of the conversation. Carol, sensing something wasn't right, urged her not to go. But Cecilia was firm in her decision. She told Carol that she needed to see Mario one last time to ensure he was truly leaving. The two sisters talked at length, with Carol making one final plea for her to reconsider. Cecilia reassured her, saying everything would be fine and promising to call as soon as Mario boarded the plane. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday, April 28th. Cecilia planned to be at Sydney International Airport by 7 a.m. to say her final goodbye before heading to an important business meeting. She was hopeful that this would mark the end of a painful chapter in her life. But the next day, something strange happened. Instead of receiving the promised phone call, Carol received a message from Cecilia, and that was when Carol's unease turned into alarm. In the message, Cecilia claimed that she needed a break from everything that had happened over the past few months. She wrote that she had decided to go to the mountains for a couple of days to clear her head and reflect on her future. She mentioned she wouldn't be reachable for a while, and asked not to be disturbed. It didn't sit right with Carol, or with anyone else who received a similar message. Carol's unease quickly turned to concern when she tried to call her sister back. The call went straight to voicemail. Cecilia's phone had already been turned off. Still, Carol tried to convince herself it might be nothing, that perhaps Cecilia really had needed some space after all the stress she had endured. However, multiple friends, clients, and colleagues began reporting that they too had received the same type of message from Cecilia. Short, vague, and uncharacteristically formal. Even more troubling, she had failed to attend any of her scheduled meetings that day. including a highly anticipated business consultation with potential investors. This was completely unlike her. That evening, after attempting to contact her numerous times without success, Cecilia's loved ones could no longer ignore the sinking feeling. Carol, joined by Rita and a few close friends, went to the police to officially report Cecilia Haddad missing. They brought with them every detail they could provide: her recent movements, the names of people she had been in contact with, and most crucially, the identity of a man who had recently made her life incredibly difficult, Mario Santoro. But by the next morning, that faint hope was devastated when authorities contacted her family with tragic news. Carol was asked to come in to view and identify someone who matched Cecilia's description. On the morning of April 29, 2018, just a day after Cecilia had reportedly planned to meet Mario at the airport, a local man was out fishing on the Cove River. While the spot was usually known for its quiet beauty, that day took a grim turn. The fisherman noticed something unusual floating near the shoreline. Disturbed by what he had found, he immediately contacted the local authorities. Police arrived quickly, and an investigation was launched on the scene. The woman found in the water had no form of identification on her. Her appearance suggested she was in her late 30s, and her clothes were carefully examined for clues. The lack of ID meant the initial priority for investigators was to identify who she was and determine what had led to her tragic fate. Detectives reviewed missing persons reports and found one that stood out: 38-year-old Cecilia Haddad, who had last been heard from on April 28th, and whose sister and friends had filed a missing persons report the previous evening. Comparing photographs and physical descriptions, the investigators quickly suspected the woman recovered from the river was Cecilia. Later that day, her family was brought in, and the worst was confirmed. Carol identified her sister. Detectives immediately launched a full-scale investigation. Their focus turned quickly to Mario Santoro, the ex-boyfriend who had been causing Cecilia distress for several months. The evidence began to mount quickly. Although Mario did not own a car of his own, he used Cecilia's vehicle. Investigators examined her car and discovered various fingerprints and signs that it had recently been used. Phone data became another critical point in the case. By tracing cell tower pings, police were able to map Mario's movements on the day Cecilia disappeared. The data revealed an unusual route, far from the typical path one would take to the airport. Additionally, traffic cameras showed Mario in several locations that lined up with the timeline of Cecilia's disappearance. A breakthrough came when authorities tracked down a taxi driver who had driven Mario to the airport. The driver recalled the ride clearly, not because Mario behaved erratically, but because of a strange request. The passenger had asked for an unexpected detour across a small bridge spanning a quiet portion of the river. Once there, he exited the vehicle briefly, walked over to the edge, and was seen tossing a bag into the water. He also appeared to throw a smaller object, possibly keys, before returning to the taxi and continuing to the airport. The driver retraced the route with the police and brought them to the exact spot where the items had been discarded. Dive teams were immediately deployed to search the riverbed in that area. Fortunately, the water current was weak, and visibility was decent. Within hours, the search team made a significant discovery: a large handbag submerged under the water, which contained Cecilia's mobile phone, her work laptop, personal documents, a wallet, and various items that confirmed the bag belonged to her. Not long afterward, the divers also recovered a set of house keys, believed to be the same ones Mario had retained without permission. Back at the command center, the full picture of what had happened was becoming disturbingly clear. Mario, after his final conversation with Cecilia, had never intended to board a flight out of Sydney as a simple farewell. Instead, it now appeared that his intentions were far more sinister. By the time Cecilia's body had been recovered, Mario was already thousands of miles away, having landed in Rio de Janeiro the day after the incident. He likely believed that by fleeing the country, he could escape scrutiny and avoid legal consequences. But the evidence collected by Australian authorities left no room for doubt. The digital footprints, forensic discoveries, and witness testimony formed a powerful case. With everything compiled, law enforcement contacted Interpol and formally issued a request for international assistance. Mario Santoro was now officially wanted for questioning in connection with a serious case. After nearly 2 months of investigation, coordination between agencies, and legal preparations, Brazilian law enforcement finally located Mario on July 7, 2018. He was found staying in a friend's apartment, where he had kept a low profile, seemingly trying to avoid detection. He did not resist arrest and immediately asked for a lawyer. In initial interviews, Mario denied all involvement, presenting himself as a victim of circumstance. But the volume and weight of evidence told a different story. Witnesses testified to his controlling behavior. Messages and call logs demonstrated a pattern of harassment. The physical evidence placed him at the scene. And the contents recovered from the river left no doubt that he had gone to great lengths to erase his presence. Eventually, under the pressure of overwhelming facts and the emotional weight of the testimonies, Mario's story began to crumble. While he never provided a full confession, his shifting narratives and evasive statements did little to convince anyone of his innocence. According to the results of the extensive and meticulous investigation carried out by law enforcement, it became clear that by the time Mario Santoro booked his international flight, he had already formed a grim plan concerning his former partner, Cecilia Haddad. In the early hours of Saturday, April 28, 2018, at approximately 5:30 a.m., Mario arrived at Cecilia's apartment complex in the Sydney suburb where she lived. According to digital records, he rang the building's intercom, attempting to gain entry. Cecilia, expecting to meet him later that morning at the airport, as they had discussed on the phone, was caught completely off guard by his sudden appearance. Given their recent history and the unease she felt around him, she hesitated. She didn't immediately open the door, likely unsettled by this unplanned visit. However, what Cecilia did not know was that Mario had retained a duplicate set of keys to her building, keys she had believed were returned long ago. Using this spare key, he quietly let himself inside without causing a disturbance. Surveillance footage confirmed that no alarm was raised, and neighbors later reported hearing no suspicious sounds that morning, suggesting the encounter may have initially appeared calm, at least on the surface. It is believed that once Mario reached her apartment, he persuaded Cecilia to let him in, possibly under the pretense of wanting to talk before his flight. There was no sign of forced entry, and none of the neighbors reported any shouting or commotion, which further supported the theory that Cecilia may have opened the door voluntarily, still hoping the situation could be resolved peacefully. Unfortunately, that wasn't Mario's true intention. Investigators concluded that once inside, Mario carried out the next stage of his plan with disturbing precision. Rather than leaving for the airport, he instead drove Cecilia's vehicle toward a secluded area along the Cove River, a quiet location not frequently visited during the early morning hours. There, he left her in a place he hoped would delay discovery, giving him a greater chance to flee the country without suspicion. But Mario's actions didn't stop there. After returning to Cecilia's apartment, he began to carefully erase traces of what had happened. He entered her home, took several of her personal items including her laptop, official documents, wallet, and mobile phone, and sent carefully crafted messages from her device. The texts were sent to her sister, close friends, and a few colleagues, all stating that she had made a spontaneous decision to retreat to the mountains for a few days to reflect and recharge. With that done, Mario placed her phone, along with the other items, into a bag. He later took this bag with him when he hailed a taxi to the airport. During the ride, Mario asked the taxi driver to make an unusual detour. He requested that they drive over a small, out-of-the-way bridge, far from the main roads and bustling airport routes. When they reached the quiet crossing, Mario briefly exited the vehicle, walked to the edge, and dropped the bag into the river. He also tossed in another object, believed to be the house keys he had used earlier. Then, as if nothing had happened, he returned to the taxi, completed the ride to the airport, and boarded his flight to Rio de Janeiro, calm and composed. From the outside, it appeared that Mario had executed a plan with clinical precision. By the time local authorities discovered Cecilia's body and pieced together the first stages of the investigation, Mario was already safely on another continent. Given that he was a Brazilian national and had returned to his home country, this posed a significant legal complication. Nevertheless, the gravity of the case, combined with the mounting evidence, prompted swift international cooperation. Australian authorities worked closely with Brazilian officials and legal experts to ensure that the case could be brought to justice, even if it meant conducting the proceedings in Mario's home country. Legal teams from both nations coordinated over the following months and years to ensure a fair but firm trial, despite the geographic challenges. After years of preparation, hearings, and evidence gathering, Mario Santoro's case finally went to trial in Brazil. The proceedings took into account all of the forensic and digital evidence collected by the Australian police, as well as the extensive witness statements provided by Cecilia's family, friends, and former colleagues. Testimonies painted a clear picture of a relationship that had turned tense, one where control and fear had steadily replaced love and respect. On July 1, 2023, more than 5 years after Cecilia's untimely passing, the verdict was announced. The Brazilian court found Mario Santoro guilty of premeditated murder, as well as multiple related offenses, including tampering with evidence, obstructing justice, and attempting to mislead investigators. His actions were deemed calculated, manipulative, and deeply harmful, both to the victim and to the broader community who had been affected by the crime. Mario was sentenced to 27 years in prison with no possibility of parole.